According to the Islamic teachings, the Qur'an reflects the exact words of Allah, taken from preserved tablets in heaven given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. Yet there is a clear difference between the teachings of the Qur'an when Muhammad was in Mecca at the beginning of his ministry and when he moved to Medina, the latter part of his ministry. While many of the verses from the Meccan part of his life were relatively peaceful in nature, they were replaced or abrogated by the violent verses of the Medinan period. For example, in the Meccan period, Muhammad said about those who refused to follow his new religion, "You have your religion and I have mine." Interesting note here, by the way, is that this chapter in the Qur'an is entitled Kafirun, or infidels. But it does imply a somewhat peaceful coexistence between Jews, Christians, and the pagans who populated the deserts of Arabia. Now, that label as infidels came upon the locals, but we can at least live together as infidel and Muslim. Now, here's where it changes. After his military successes in Medina, Muhammad's tone changed. He no longer encouraged that coexistence. Instead of accommodating the non-Muslims in the cities he conquered, he simply replaced or abrogated those peaceful verses with verses encouraging violence against the non-Muslims. So the doctrine of abrogation was contrived to deal with the inconsistencies between the Meccan period and the Medinan revelations of the Qur'an. So it's clear to see that Muhammad conveniently received circumstantial revelation. This circumstantial revelation, it's a trend. Often we see it with spiritual leaders or cult leaders who conveniently receive inspiration from God, which undoes a previous rule or a previous law. What was once important is no longer important. In simple terms, he changed his mind. And then he slaps on it the label revelation. In the case of Muhammad's conflicting ideas about tolerance, Surah chapter 2, verse 106 was conveniently descended upon him. And it says this: "Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring a better one, like it, or better than it. Do you not know that Allah has the power over all things?" Now, ironically, mainly the Middle Eastern sheikhs and imams teach this correctly as it relates to this law of abrogation. These Islamic principles get discombobulated in the West because it's really difficult to accept certain teachings when they blatantly contradict modern values. So ISIS is well aware of the significance of the Medinan abrogations, and they fully adopt it into their theology, their ideology. The doctrine of abrogation is explicit with the issue of coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. In the place of the previously mentioned peaceful verse, "You have your religion and I have mine," Muhammad brought down the so-called verse of the sword. The verse of the sword is Surah 9, verse 5, and it states this: "Kill the polytheist wherever you find them, capture them and besiege them and sit in wait for them at every place of ambush. But," now there's a big condition here, "but if they should repent, establish prayer, give zakat," which is kind of like a tithe, "then you can let them go on their way." This is one example, but there are many others all throughout the Qur'an. In Surah 8, verse 12, the Qur'an says, "I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Therefore, strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them." Some translations say their whole limbs. In the presentation of Islam in the West, Muslims often present these essentially ineffective or abrogated peaceful verses to show that Islam does encourage coexistence and it's the kumbaya moments of the celebrities and the politicians. While the media focuses on this form of peaceful jihad or the peaceful version of Islam, or that form of jihad that's self-disciplining one's inner being, the Qur'an does not make such a distinction. The focus always is on military conquest, and the goal is uniting the world governments into a one-world Islamic caliphate, also known as, in our modern day, the Islamic State. Much of the West has accepted the peaceful version of Islam, it's presented to them. So In the politically correct West, Islam presents the Meccan face of peace. However, the truth is that the Meccan verses have been abrogated. That's in the correct context. And the true Islam is reflected in the Medinan verses that encourage violence and subjugation of non-Muslims. It's clear that after the migration of Muhammad to Medina, the ideas of jihad were no longer peaceful but took a turn to violence. This culminated with what is known as the Battle of Badr. It's the first ever raid in which Muhammad and his army of 300 men took on 1,000 non-Muslims and won. This is the battle which Muhammad claimed was a miraculous victory and set in stone that God approved jihad, or else how would 300 men take on 1,000 and actually win? Now, during this battle, the Battle of Badr, the wind began to blow and Muhammad claimed that these were the angels coming to the aid of the Muslims. Other sayings of Muhammad also attest to this, not just in the beginning of his Medinan ministry, but also later on in his life. So, for example, Sahih Muslim, book 32, hadith number 75 says this. Muhammad says this, "I will expel the Jews and the Christians from the Arabian Peninsula, and I will not leave any but the Muslims." Now, in saying this, I have to point out once again that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. They have no desire for a violent overthrow of the government or the social system in the West. But the problem is not Muslims. The problem exists with Muslims who enforce the Sharia or enforce the Quranic verses and Muhammad's example literally. For this reason, moderate Muslims in the West and in the Middle East must take a stand, not just for freedom and democracy and freedom of religion, but against ISIS specifically, against any form of religious aggression. In love and respect, I encourage all Muslims to ask why these verses are still taught, and when they are, to have the courage and have the boldness to take a stand. It's the only way things will change. So stay tuned for the next video, particularly for women and the Islamic State. You're going to learn a lot, and join the discussion, use the hashtag, and share these videos all over, and let's continue our journey in finding out whether ISIS is Islamic or if they're hijackers of Islam.